Questions orales. L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
After 8 years of this Liberal government, this Prime Minister is just not worth the cost. According to the PBO and the Governor of the Bank of Canada, I'm right. This Liberal Prime Minister is adding to inflation and interest rates. Scotiabank has said that these deficits are increasing interest rates by 2%. That means another $700 per month for paying the average mortgage. Before Canadians lose their homes, will this Prime Minister finally accept my common sense plan and announce a date and a plan for balancing the budget and reducing inflation and interest rates? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board. Mr. Speaker, unlike the Conservatives, our government has a plan to help Canadians to get through this difficult period. For example, we are helping 4 million Canadians with the Canada Workers' Benefit. We are also helping 6 million Canadians thanks to indexing old age security. What is the Conservative plan? No, the fact is they don't have one.
L'honorable chef de l'opposition.
Speaker, after 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost of mortgage payments, which are already up 150%, and the Bank of Canada and the Parliamentary Budget Officer now agree with me that his deficits are driving up interest rates. Scotiabank says deficits are driving mortgage rates up 2%. That works out to $700 per month. While carpenters and nurses are already living in their cars, and the IMF says Canada's mortgage holders are the most at risk of crisis. Will the Prime Minister finally accept my common sense plan and announce the date and the plan to balance the budget and bring down interest rates on Canadian mortgages so people don't lose their homes?
The Honourable President of the Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear and accurate. Much of that spending referred to by the Leader of the Opposition was provincial in nature, not federal, Mr. Speaker. And in addition, unlike the Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, we actually have a plan to help Canadians, especially vulnerable Canadians, and the Deputy Prime Minister will table additional aspects of that plan tomorrow in the fall economic statement. But let's be clear, we are here for Canadians every single step of the way, unlike the party opposite that votes against every single time, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's plan is to increase mortgage payments by 150%, which he's already done. And now Scotiabank says government deficits have added 2 percentage points to interest rates. That works out to $700 a month, or $8,400 a year in higher mortgage payments linked directly to deficits, including the massive deficits by this government. A year ago, they promised a balanced budget. They broke the promise 6 months later. Will they come back tomorrow with a plan to balance the budget so we can bring down interest rates and inflation so that Canadians can keep their homes?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, we have a plan that's going to build more homes, that's going to restore a level of affordability in the market. Where we are cutting taxes on home builders, he wants to raise them. Where we are funding cities to increase their ambition on home building, he wants to cut them. Mr. Speaker, it is hard to accept criticisms from a member of the House of Commons who, when he had the opportunity to be the minister responsible for housing, had access to $300 million and only got 99 homes built. Mr. Speaker, we are going to build homes, and we are going to build them by the millions.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when I was housing minister, mortgage payments were less than half of what they are now, and rent was less than half of what it is now. Those are the hard realities. And now his plan, the Prime Minister's plan, is to quadruple the carbon tax. Quadruple it. That will increase the cost of gas, heat, groceries, and yes, even housing, because it takes trucks to ship those building materials. We know that we will have a carbon tax election to decide on whether we axe the tax as I choose or whether we hike it as he promises. But can we accept a Canadian compromise and at least freeze the tax in the meantime? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister for Housing and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to listen to this version of revisionist history of the honourable member's time as a minister responsible for housing. If we actually go back and look at the numbers, you're going to see that he actually had housing starts less than 200,000 a year. Mr. Speaker, this morning we've seen data that shows that we're on pace to build more than 256,000 this year. If we want to compare apples to apples, Mr. Speaker, we're going to make a difference. Do you like apples? We're going to beat his numbers. How do you like them apples?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I think the minister should stick to photo ops because comedy is surely not his thing. Neither are numbers, Mr. Speaker. Everything the Prime Minister has said about the Stellantis subsidy is proven false. One, it's billions of dollars over budget before shovels in the ground, years behind payback even before the project begins, and he claimed that it was going to create jobs for Canadians. We now learn that at least 1,500 or a majority of the jobs are going to go to temporary foreign workers. Will the Prime Minister release the contract now so that we can find out how much Canadian taxpayers are going to have to spend to give paychecks to South Korean workers?
The Honourable Minister for Housing and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, during the COVID-19 pandemic, he opposed spending that was supporting families. Now, during a national housing crisis, he opposes government investments that are actually going to get more homes built. And when we have the opportunity to make generational investments that's going to gain a toehold in a new industry, he opposes it without vision for what the future economy could be when we create many thousands of jobs. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to invest in the Canadian economy and put workers make sure they bring home paychecks that are going to put food on the table for their families.
Hear, hear. L'honorable député de La Prairie.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow is the economic update. The Minister of Finance needs to understand that fiscal rigor doesn't mean that we should have austerity on the backs of small businesses. More than 220,000 SMEs may go bankrupt if the Minister doesn't extend reimbursing the Canada Emergency Business Account without losing the grants. The National Assembly of Quebec is asking for that extension. Provincial premiers are asking for it. Everyone is asking the federal government to give our SMEs more flexibility. It's unanimous. Will the minister finally give businesses the extension they need so much tomorrow?
L'honorable Ministre.
Monsieur le Président,
The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, small businesses have asked for our help. That's why our government put off the maximum eligibility date, putting it off into 2024. We have also announced an extension on refunding certain loans until the end of 2026. Our government is always listening to small businesses.
L'honorable député de La...
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, entrepreneurs are tired of hearing this. In the economic update, the minister should also keep her promises to families who can no longer pay for groceries. During the election, the Liberals promised $1 billion over 5 years to fund school meal programs. Tomorrow, the minister must make this election promise a reality. Fiscal rigor is not the same thing as austerity, and some people are not able to feed their families. Will the minister keep her promise tomorrow and announce that she is transferring money to Quebec for food assistance in schools? The Honourable Minister. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question.
Many Canadians are having a hard time putting food on the table, and we're working with provinces, territories, municipalities, key stakeholders as we work to develop a national school food policy. We are doing the hard work now together with our partners, understanding the importance of moving forward together. We'll continue this progress. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
L'honorable député de Rosemont, la petite...
The Honourable Member for Rosemont, la Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, people are struggling to pay for rent and groceries. In Montreal, people are actually coming together to help food banks that are buckling under the strain. And meanwhile, big CEOs are raking in the profits. Loblaws alone brought in $18 billion in profits in a single semester. We've never seen that before. Their greed is boundless, and the Liberals are doing nothing to stop them. Tomorrow is a concrete opportunity to help people. Will the Liberals have the courage to lower food prices and to do something about CEOs' greed?
L'honorable président du Conseil du Trésor.
Monsieur le Président, la loi sur le logement et l'épicerie abordable, ça c'est la loi que nous considérons maintenant. Et il faut que nous continuions d'appuyer tout le monde dans notre pays avec l'épicerie.
Je regrette à interrompre l'honorable ministre, mais apparemment.
I'm sorry to interrupt the minister, but there was no interpretation. The interpreter apologizes. The mic was off. Interpretation is now back. I will ask the Honorable President of the Treasury Board to resume. From the beginning, please. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we know that the Affordable Groceries Act is very important to our country, and we will continue to support the bill that we are debating because that is crucial at this time in our country. And I would like to thank all of our colleagues here in the House for supporting us with this important piece of legislation. We will continue to be there for the Canadian public.
The honourable member from Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill C-56 certainly, and I think after some improvement by New Democrats, is going to help a little bit with the housing crisis, but it's certainly not going to solve the housing crisis. The Fall Economic Statement is an important opportunity to make further progress both on the housing crisis and the affordability crisis. We've got funds that have been depleted for social housing that need to be replenished, and there's further work to do on strengthening competition laws in Canada. So are these initiatives that we're going to see in the Fall Economic Statement, or are Canadians going to be left waiting again?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question. He knows that he and I will both wait for tomorrow to see the details of the Fall Economic Statement. However, I do want to signal my intent to continue the pattern of investment in affordable housing in particular that's going to make sure everyone in this country has a safe and affordable place to call home. Mr. Speaker, over the 30 years that preceded our time in government, governments of different stripe chose not to make the necessary investments to ensure that we had sufficient affordable housing stock. We're going to continue to make the investments that are necessary in affordable housing to restore something to the ecosystem, and that's a level of affordability that we desperately need.
The honourable member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
After 8 long years, the Governor of the Bank of Canada confirmed that this Prime Minister and his scam of the century, the carbon tax, are not worth the cost. Scrapping this scam would put a massive dent in inflation and help lower interest rates faster, all at a time when Canadians are choosing between eating and heating their homes because of Liberal inflation and because of the carbon tax. Will the Finance Minister accept our Conservative leaders' common sense ask to axe their plans to quadruple their carbon tax in tomorrow's false promise update? Yes or no?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm truly glad to hear the Conservative member opposite be so excited for tomorrow's fall economic update, Mr. Speaker. You see, the Minister of Finance and the Deputy Prime Minister will be in this House at 4 p.m. tomorrow to reveal our books and to show the plan that we have prepared for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. This is an important moment of transparency for Canadians to see where we are at and where we are going, an important moment as well for Conservatives to actually see the numbers and use the facts in order to have intelligent debate in this House.
The honourable member from Calgary Forest Lawn.
Well, more photo ops aren't going to help anyone here in Canada, Mr. Speaker. And what we won't do as a Conservative government is create two classes of Canadians like this Liberal NDP government did by giving 3% of Canadians in Atlantic Canada, where the Prime Minister's poll numbers were tanking, a break, while the rest of Canadians get absolutely nothing and have to freeze and starve in the dark. 2 million Canadians are visiting a food bank in a month. This in just a single month. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost after 8 years. Will they cancel their plan to quadruple their carbon tax in tomorrow's False Hopes update? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the honourable member says is both factually incorrect and grossly misleading. We have put a price on pollution in this country, one that actually helps us to address the existential threat that is climate change, but do so in a manner that is affordable. 8 out of 10 Canadian families get more money back than they pay in the carbon price. It is a manner that is affordable for Canadians, at the same time taking on and addressing what is a clear threat to the future of our children. It is such a shame that in this country we still have a political party that doesn't believe that climate change is real.
The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of out-of-control spending by this Liberal government, experts at Scotiabank now say that 2 percentage points of interest rate increases are due to government spending. An extra 2% on mortgage costs means over $8,000 a year for Canadian borrowers. Canadians are realizing this Prime Minister's not worth the cost. When Scotiabank says you're richer than you think, they didn't mean spend like drunken sailors. So on what date will the government balance the budget?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, let's speak about balance, because our government believes that you can balance compassion with fiscal responsibility, and that is what we have shown to date, Mr. Speaker. Canada continues to have the lowest deficit among all G7 countries. Canada continues to have the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio among all G7 countries. And the very report that member is citing, Mr. Speaker, states that the major drivers of interest rate increases were COVID supports and provincial spending, not federal spending, but provincial spending, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we won't apologize for having Canadians' backs while being responsible.
The honourable member from Simcoe North.
Mr. Speaker, my message for any provincial premier is the same as the message for the Prime Minister. Take responsibility for the government spending, because it's driving inflation and making interest rates unaffordable for Canadians. The Bank of Canada says that all governments need to spend less than 2% in order to keep inflation under control. This own government's projections in the budget in the spring says that this government will spend over 3.5% growth next year versus this year. So when are they going to get it? They are part of the problem. They have to balance the budget so Canadians can keep their homes.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite talks about responsibility. It's this government that took its responsibility seriously. When times were tough, when COVID hit, and even today, Mr. Speaker, we continue to have Canadians' backs. We don't just talk about compassion, Mr. Speaker. We act in that manner by being there for vulnerable Canadians, by being there in order to lift over 2.3 million Canadians out of poverty, by ensuring over 1 million more Canadians have a job today than they did before COVID. Mr. Speaker, we are there for Canadians while being fiscally responsible, and I am certainly looking forward to tomorrow's fiscal update.
L'honorable député de Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles.
The honourable member for Charlebourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, for 8 years we've seen this NDP Liberal government with their friends in the Bloc Québécois spend without any form of control. Experts at Scotiabank calculated that these excessive forms of spending will add 2 percentage points to Canada's interest rates, which represents $8,000 per year in additional cost for the average mortgage. This government could help Quebecers face the cost of living. Will it listen to the experts, stop spending so much, and announce a return to a balanced budget in its mini-budget tomorrow? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I'm so pleased to see this enthusiasm about the economic statement tomorrow. But I would like to hear my colleague from Quebec on the other hand, talk about what he's considering in his austerity plan. Is he thinking that we should make cuts to the new childcare spaces that we've made? Is he thinking that we should cut supports for our seniors? Is that it? I think my colleague should be specific at this point. We will be listening. The honorable member for Charlesbourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Well, the first thing we'd cut is useless spending like on ArriveCan and various other expenses during COVID that even the parliamentary budget officer has no idea what it was for. That's hundreds of millions of dollars that was spent on nothing. We have an incredibly long list of such expenses from this government. If we cut all that out, we get back to a balanced budget and Canadians would do a lot better. Will this Prime Minister come back to a balanced budget tomorrow in the economic statement? Yes or no?
L'honorable ministre des Transports.
The Honorable Minister of Transport. Well, this colleague just said that he would have cut the costs we used during COVID. Now, that's all over now, first of all, but also he wants to make other types of cuts because that's these Conservatives' policy. What exactly would they cut? Childcare? Help for seniors? Or would he do nothing about climate change? He wants us to do less on women's rights, on human rights, and he really wants to bring us back to the Stone Age.
L'honorable député de Salaberry-sur-Roi.
The honorable member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, once again, we need to talk about this federal government's management of the borders. Radio-Canada has revealed that Mexican drug cartels are taking advantage of this government's negligence. And it's taking advantage of that to make a fortune. For example, they're producing fake Mexican passports to help smuggle people to Canada and the US. Mr. Speaker, both the RCMP and CSIS alerted the Minister of Public Safety about this last spring. What has the government been doing since the spring to take back control of its own borders?
L'honorable ministre.
The Honorable Minister. Mr. Speaker, of course, we share all Canadians' concerns about the integrity of our borders. And that is why we have invested more to strengthen our security posture at the border. That is why I went to Washington a month and a half ago. I spoke with the Americans about how we can further cooperate. I also spoke with Quebec's Minister of Public Safety. We will continue to increase officers at the border to ensure that safety there is maintained. The honorable member for Salaberry-sur-Roi. Mr. Speaker, I repeat, there is a human smuggling network at the Canadian border organized by Mexican drug cartels. And the federal government knows all about that because our intelligence services told the government what was happening. The Quebec government is very concerned. In fact, it said that at some point, someone is going to have to wake up in Ottawa. The Quebec government also said that the federal government is unfortunately not doing its work, and Quebec is having to take on that burden. Mr. Speaker, when will this government finally take back control of its own borders? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's not that I want to disagree with my colleague, but we have not lost control of the border. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, we are working closely with our intelligence and security services. As much as possible, under Canadian intelligence legislation, we are sharing information to enable our partners, whether American, Mexican, Canadian, including our Quebec partners, to enable them to do everything they can to better secure our borders. And I'm looking forward to continuing these positive discussions with the minister in Quebec on this topic. The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, just for a second, put yourself in the shoes of people trying to leave Mexico. They're willing to do a lot to leave their country, especially because of the cartels. Cartels that have tendrils everywhere and absolutely no respect for human life. And then imagine how they feel when they get to Canada and they realize that the same old cartels are controlling the border here. Those same cartels, even in Canada, are going to make money off them. Mr. Speaker, when will this government finally show some humanity? When will it finally take back control of the border? The Honourable Minister, Mr. Speaker, a few moments ago, I said that we as a government have taken action right from the beginning of the situation to protect our border. We have spoken with our American and Mexican partners. We have spoken about the importance of controlling irregular migration. And we have invested a great deal more in border safety services and our intelligence services. Exactly in order to do everything we can to continue to keep our borders safe. Of course, we are always looking for new good ideas to better improve the situation.
The honourable member from South Surrey, White Rock.
After 8 years of this NDP Liberal government and 2 years of their housing accelerator, photo ops are up exponentially, but investment in housing construction is down 14%. The Prime Minister promised to make housing more affordable. What has he delivered? Nothing but photos of suits in boots. Canada has the lowest number of housing units per capita in the G7. This Prime Minister is not worth the cost. When will he put aside his photo op obsession and focus on roofs overheads and keys indoors?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, it's an excellent question, if only if it were based in fact. The member has claimed that, in fact, investment in housing has gone down. I read from the Stats Canada report issued just this morning that multi-unit construction rose 8.2% to $6.6 billion in September, with all provinces reporting gains. Mr. Speaker, residential builds up 7.3% to $12.9 billion. With respect to the Housing Accelerator Fund, we have deals with Kitchener, Calgary, Kelowna, cities across the country, totaling over the next 10 years more than 175,000 more homes. They promised to cut it.
The honourable member from South Surrey, White Rock.
Mr. Speaker, photo ops don't build homes. We need more homes in Canada, a lot more, not less. 14% less year over year is what failure looks like. We need homes, not bureaucracy. Since this housing minister took over, investment in housing construction is still plummeting, down 14% year over year. After 8 years, rent and down payments have doubled and mortgages are up 150%. When will this Prime Minister stop the photo ops, let builders build so Canadians can move into homes they can afford?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, I hate to delight in such a moment where the honourable member in good faith tries to pose a question but just doesn't have the facts. She has claimed that investment has plummeted literally on the day that Stats Canada has indicated it's increased by 7.3%. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the strategy we're going to use to build more homes, we're going to change the math to make it work for builders by reducing taxes. They plan to raise it. We want to change the way that cities build homes by putting money on the table. They plan to cut it. We will make the investments necessary. We will engage with the sector and other levels of government to get more homes built, whatever it takes.
The honourable member from Northumberland, Peterborough South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 8 years, this NDP Liberal government, millions of Canadians can never afford to buy a home. Millions of Canadians can't afford to keep their home. According to a recent Scotiabank report, the cost of the average mortgage is going to go up by more than $700 because of their profligate spending. When will these Liberals stop blaming everyone else and finally take responsibility for the housing crisis they caused?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member wants to do something to help with the housing crisis right now, he can talk to his leader and tell him to stop blocking the cut to the GST that's going to unlock hundreds of thousands of homes across this country. Mr. Speaker, we are cutting taxes for home building. They plan to raise them. We are putting money on the table to get more cities to change the way that they build homes. They want to cut it. And Mr. Speaker, if his concern is around spending driving inflation, I would ask him to imagine a world where we decided not to support households, not to support businesses through the pandemic. We would be dealing with millions of Canadians who would have lost their home years ago. We are going to make the investments to build millions in the years ahead.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member from Nunavut.
If the Liberals say that they will do whatever it takes for housing, Nunavut needs $250 million. One-third of Nunavut live in homes needing major repairs, and over 50% in my riding are in overcrowded homes. The situation is so bad that TB outbreaks in 2 more communities were announced earlier this year. Last year, the government of Nunavut asked the Liberals for $200 million to build urgently needed housing. So far, they got zero. Will the Minister of Finance announce tomorrow the housing funding that Nunavut desperately needs?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that very important question. We are fully engaged with the government of Nunavut, with Inuit rights holders on this important issue. In 2022, we announced $4 billion for Indigenous rights holders, including $800 million for Inuit rights holders. We have $4 billion as well for the rural, northern, and urban strategy, something we were going to roll out in the months to come.
The Honourable Member from Winnipeg Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Winnipeg is in a dire housing crisis. As of last year, 6,000 people were on a wait list for public housing. People are freezing to death in bus shelters. The Winnipeg City Council is voting to change zoning laws in hopes that this government will grant the required funding to deal with the housing crisis. People are dying in the streets. Will the Liberals commit to the $192 million of requested funding to build new housing stock and treat Winnipeg's housing crisis with the urgency it deserves?
Hear, hear. The Honourable Minister for Housing, Communities and Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I want to say thank you to my honourable colleague for the urgency with which she intends to address the housing crisis in Winnipeg. I'm pleased to share that I most recently met with the Mayor of Winnipeg just this morning. I've been engaging with the city over the course of the last number of weeks and months in order to help facilitate the very reforms that the Council will be debating. We have put federal money on the table to incentivize cities like Winnipeg right across the country to change the way that they allow homes to get built. We're going to continue to work with the most ambitious cities in Canada and use that federal funding to get more homes built for Canadians.
The Honourable Member from Sudbury. L'honorable député de Sudbury, je m'excuse.
A week ago, the Minister of Labour tabled legislation to ban replacement workers, a commitment we made to Canadians in 2021. Since tabling the bill, workers and unions have applauded this historic move. Yet, 11 days later, the Leader of the Opposition still hasn't taken a position on the legislation. He's had enough time to study it, so why is he hesitating to support workers? Can the Minister of Labour advise why the Leader of the Opposition should stand on the side of working families instead of corporate lobbyists?
Honourable members, many issues have been brought up regarding how questions are relevant to the question of the administration of the House, administration of the government rather, or questions regarding committee chairs. I will be issuing a ruling after question period, after the votes that are going to be happening here. But I see that the minister has stood up on his feet and intends to answer. I will allow the minister to take this if he so desires, but members should be aware of the ruling that will be coming from the Speaker shortly.
Mr. Speaker, we are proud to have tabled legislation to ban the use of replacement workers. Workers have been asking for this legislation longer than this country has existed. This legislation will keep unions and employers at the bargaining table because, Mr. Speaker, that's where the powerful paychecks are created, at the bargaining table. Members of other parties understand the importance of this bill, and I hope that members opposite will as well. But then again, this is a leader who championed two of the most anti-worker, anti-union bills that this House has ever seen. Will he support the bill? We'll see.
The Honourable Member from Lethbridge.
The Prime Minister promised to make life more affordable for Canadians when he took office, but after 8 years of this Liberal government, rent has doubled, mortgage payments have skyrocketed, and housing prices have doubled as well. Just in today, we found out that housing construction rates are actually down by 14% concerning investment. Only this Liberal government would use a housing accelerator fund to decelerate housing. Contrary to Liberal belief, photo ops don't build houses. I know this is news. So when will the housing minister stop the photo ops and actually get some work done?
The Honourable Minister for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member has concerns about the use of photo ops, I'd suggest she discuss with her leader why he shows up at projects that he had nothing to do with to take a photo and then uses homelessness as a political prop for his social media. Mr. Speaker, the reality is that member knows that we have a plan to build more homes. It's to cut taxes and to put money on the table for home building. They want to raise taxes and cut that money for home building. Mr. Speaker, I was in the honourable member's province just last week announcing a $228 million agreement that's going to see the City of Calgary add more than 35,000 homes over the next 10 years. We're going to continue to do the work that's necessary to get.
The Honourable Member from Lethbridge.
What the honourable member knows is this. Rent prices have doubled, house prices have doubled, mortgage rates have skyrocketed, and investment in housing construction is down 14%. This minister just isn't getting the job done, despite his promises to Canadians. So when will he stop the photo ops and actually get to work so that Canadians can have a roof over their head?
The Honourable Minister, for Housing, Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to the honourable member, she's saying that investments are down. In her province, Stats Canada indicated this morning it's up 10.6%. The reality is the numbers are continuing to increase because of the measures we're putting on the table. When we decided to eliminate GST, we saw announcements that are going to lead to 300,000 homes over the next decade. With respect to the Housing Accelerator Fund, the changes cities are making so far have unlocked 175,000 homes. Mr. Speaker, we are going to continue to make the investments necessary to get more homes built over and above the hundreds of thousands that the National Housing Strategy has already delivered.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have in my hands a copy of the first page of the local newspaper of Thetford Mines. After 8 years of the Liberal government's inflationary policies, here is a sad reality in our regions, and I will read for you. Rise in food support needs in Thetford Mines, and Scotiabank has confirmed that Liberal spending has made interest rates rise by 2%. This rise is felt by families who are increasingly going to food banks to feed themselves. Will the Prime Minister stop his massive overspending and tell us exactly when we will have a balanced budget? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, there have been many questions in a row about housing from the Conservative Party, but I find that surprising because we are currently debating a bill in this House that will enable more home building throughout the country, and the bill will also stabilize grocery prices everywhere in Canada, Mr. Speaker. On October 5th, about 46 days ago, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative member for Mission-Wetsquee, Fraser Canyon, he finally understood that he should vote for our bill. So can he convince the Conservative leader, who seems to be uncertain? The Honourable Member for Mégantic-L'Érable. Mr. Speaker, in a message on social media, the leader of the Bloc Québécois said to want the balance of power, but he doesn't say how he will balance a Liberal budget. For instance, we know that the Bloc supports the Liberals' inflationary spending. The Bloc will now keep the Liberals in power over the next 2 years. The Bloc supports drastic increases in carbon taxes and inflationary deficits. The Bloc wants to keep the Liberals in power. It's costly to vote Bloc, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister continue sending more and more Quebecers to food banks just to get the support of the Bloc Québécois? Both these parties want to drastically increase taxes at the expense of Canadians. Once again, as I said to the member for Sudbury, It is important to have questions that relate to the administration of the government. But the Speaker will issue a ruling on that soon. I don't see any ministers or parliamentary secretaries rising. So, we will now go to...
À l'ordre, s'il vous plaît.
Order, please.
À l'ordre, s'il vous plaît.
Order, please.
Je reconnais le député de Lac-Saint.
The member for Saint-Jean has the floor. Mr. Speaker, we already knew that the Liberals were planning to give an $8 billion military aircraft contract to Boeing without tendering, thus excluding Bombardier and Quebec's expertise. Now the Americans are putting pressure on them. The U.S. ambassador to Canada has written to Liberal ministers asking them to oppose a call for tenders. Mr. Speaker, I remind the Liberals that they work for their constituents, not for Washington. And I remind the Liberals that they owe it to their constituents to ensure that they are purchasing the best aircraft by letting Bombardier bid for the contract. Will the Liberal government finally issue a call for tenders? The Honourable Minister.
Patrol aircraft is a vital capability of the Canadian Armed Forces and it's used for a wide variety of operations. They must be replaced to ensure that we continue to have this vital capability. We know that defence procurement is a key driver of economic activity, and the Government of Canada has made it very clear the benefits to the Canadian economy and to our defence and aerospace sectors is a key consideration in the decision that we will be making.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, Quebec's aerospace industry isn't asking for a handout. It's just asking to be able to compete. It's asking the federal government to give Quebec workers a chance to put their expertise to good use before gifting $8 billion in public funds to the United States. Mr. Speaker, it's normal for the U.S. ambassador to defend Boeing, an American company, because that's his job. What's not normal, though, is that the federal government is not even giving Quebecois companies a chance to compete. When is this government going to do its job and issue a call for tenders? The Honourable Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for raising this very important question. She said that we should do our job, and that's exactly what we are doing. We are meeting the demands and needs of national defense, and we are also supporting our aerospace industry in Quebec and in Canada. There are 20,000 jobs in support of our aerospace industry in Canada and almost $220 billion of financial activity and investment every year, and we will continue to support them.
The Honourable Member of Parliament from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
Years of this Prime Minister, it's easy to see he's not worth the cost as the seams come apart at his billion-dollar green slush fund. The NDP Liberal government's hand-picked chair funneled more than $200,000 to her own company and then put $120,000 of that into her own pockets. Now she's being investigated by the Ethics Commissioner, so she resigned days after the Chief Executive Officer. We're just scratching the surface on the latest of this Prime Minister's many scandals, and Canadians want to know who got rich.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Distribute taxpayer dollars, however independent of the federal government ministry. We all should expect them to do so responsibly. And that's why the Minister of Innovation acted immediately when allegations of mismanagement surfaced. We've frozen funds, ordered an independent review, are collaborating with the Auditor General, and both the CEO and the board chair have stepped down. We are holding SDTC accountable, and we're committed to getting to the bottom of this issue. Thank you.
The Honourable Member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes.
They're not holding anyone accountable. Let's just get a couple facts on the record. The board chair, handpicked by this Prime Minister, funneled more than $200,000 to her own company. So the Ethics Commissioner launched an investigation and she quit. They found more than $40 million in ineligible payments. So the Auditor General launched an investigation and the CEO quit. This government is doing absolutely nothing. So before the paper shredders get fired up over a green slush fund headquarters, will the minister agree that a parliamentary inquiry needs to be expanded so we can get all the information in the latest scandal involving this Prime Minister and their corrupt government?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
The member opposite's question, he's not entitled to his own facts. We know that the board chair of SDTC was appointed by multiple governments, including a Conservative government in the past. The Minister of Innovation has accepted the resignation of the chair of the board of SDTC. A process will begin soon to find a new leadership team. Our government is committed to ensure that organizations which receive federal funding adhere to the highest standards of governance, and we are committed to getting to the bottom of the allegations. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, after 8 years of this Liberal government, there is a familiar smell here in this chamber, the smell of Liberal scandal. The President of Sustainable Development Technology Canada, imagine, she's a Liberal appointee and a friend of the Prime Minister, and she confirmed that she had used the Green Fund to give a $217,000 grant to her own company. Mr. Speaker, when and how does the government intend to recover taxpayers' money from the Green Fund that is enriching the Prime Minister's Liberal pals?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Let me say again, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are not entitled to their facts in this matter. We are committed to getting to the bottom of the allegations, and that's why we've acted responsibly and responded to hold SDTC accountable. We know that the chair of the board was appointed by multiple governments, including the Conservative government of past, and the Minister of Innovation has accepted the resignation of the chair of the board, and a process will begin very shortly to ensure that a new leadership team is appointed. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for l'Honorable Député de
The Honourable Member for Dorval-Lachine-LaSalle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Artists and creators are operating in a cultural reality where nowadays the way we consume movies and TV shows and music is very different. There has been a major transformation. Households are unsubscribing from cable to watch shows online, but one thing has not changed, and that is the importance of having stories made by us and for us. Can the minister tell us about plans to ensure the protection and promotion of Canadian content and creators on online platforms? Thank you very much. The Honourable Minister of Canadian Heritage. Mr. Speaker, my colleague is very right. The audiovisual landscape has totally changed since the Broadcasting Act was first introduced, and that's why we are modernizing it to adapt it to today's digital universe. In fact, recently I met with actors in the cultural sector to announce the final policy directive which aims to protect users and support jobs in Canada. We want journalists and artists and everyone in the creative industry can have a strong presence online. The only people who don't understand that are the Conservatives, who opposed at every stage of us modernizing the Act, and it was really shameful, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member from Brantford-Brant.
Mr. Speaker, after 8 years, it's time for this NDP Liberal government to end the cover-ups and come clean with Canadians about the ArriveCamp scandal. 2 senior bureaucrats were caught lying to committee about their role in hiring a 2-person basement company for the $54 million Arrive scam. With cozy relationships with this government, GC Strategies was hired over Deloitte, Microsoft, and Apple. Outrageous. Wow. Which Liberal minister hired the company and paid them $11 million taxpayer dollars for doing absolutely nothing?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've said repeatedly that we expect all public officials responsible for contracting to follow the appropriate rules. In this case, the Canadian Border Services Agency identified irregularities during a routine audit and referred the matter to the appropriate authorities that are investigating. And, Mr. Speaker, people who did not follow the appropriate contracting rules will face the consequences according to law.
Yep.
Even ministers?
The Honourable Member from Calgary-Mindapore.
After 8
years of this Liberal NDP government, one thing is clear. They have no respect for the Canadian taxpayer. GC Strategies, a two-person company working out of their basement, got paid $11 million to send messages on LinkedIn to other companies to build the ArriveCan app. This Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost. Bureaucrats refuse to say who signed the paper to hire GC Strategies for $11 million. So I'm going to ask this Liberal caucus, which Liberal minister paid $11 million for GC Strategies?
To remind members, all questions do go through the chair. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, just because our colleague repeats the same silly premise to the question doesn't make it accurate. She knows very well that the authorities in these contracting matters are in the hands of public servants, and we've said very clearly, Mr. Speaker, that the committee can investigate and should investigate these matters. The Canadian Border Services Agency uncovered the contracting challenge, Mr. Speaker, in an internal audit and did what is appropriate, referred it to the appropriate authorities, and those who didn't follow the rules will be held accountable under law.
The Honourable Member from South Shore, St. Margaret's.
The NDP Liberal government is subsidizing $15 billion to the giant auto company Stellantis for their Windsor plant to employ up to 1,600 foreign workers. Every mom on a minimum wage, every couple struggling with their monthly mortgage payment, every union assembly line worker across this country will pay $1,000 to employ these foreign workers. After 8 years, this Prime Minister is not worth the cost. Will the Prime Minister reverse his decision and commit that all jobs at the Stellantis plant will go to Canadian paychecks and not foreign workers?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, as a Windsorite, I am proud that it was this Liberal government that delivered the battery plant for Windsor, including 2,500 jobs. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to work with unions. We'll continue to work with Stellantis to make sure that local Canadian workers are prioritized. It's 2,500 good jobs will be created at this plant. Those are the facts, Mr. Speaker. We believe in Canadian workers. We believe in electric vehicles. We believe in climate change. Why is the Conservative leader so against the battery plant, so against Canadian workers, and is completely empty on climate change?
The Honourable Member from Vaughan Woodbridge.
In Canada, we take pride in our tourism industry, showing our country's beauty. Tourism is essential to Canada's economy, being one of the country's top sectors and supporting more than 2 million jobs. No other sector has an economic impact that reaches from coast to coast to coast. This was highlighted in the Federal Tourism Growth Strategy this summer, and it's why we will continue to support our tourism strategy. Can the Minister responsible for the Federal Economic Development Agency for Southern Ontario tell us how our government is supporting local tourism?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about the great announcement made by my colleague today, the Minister of Tourism, that will grow the tourism sector. The newly launched Tourism Growth Program will support expanding and developing local tourism businesses from coast to coast to coast. Our government knows that local tourism grows our economy, creates good Canadian jobs, and will continue to position Canada as a destination choice for domestic and international travelers. Thank you to all those who work in the tourism sector. Please take a look at the Tourism Growth Program and apply today.
The Honourable Member from Windsor West.
Mr. Speaker, it was revealed that 1,500 temporary foreign workers could be coming to Windsor to work on the building of the new Stellantis LGEV battery plant that is receiving $15 billion in taxpayer money from the federal and provincial governments. Now, both the federal Liberal and Ford's Conservatives committed to jobs and training guarantees for local workers, and they had 18 months to get this right. Communities in Windsor and Ontario expect what was promised. Will the Liberals guarantee that these jobs are unionized and go to the people in Windsor, Tecumseh, Essex County, and not a single cent goes to foreign workers?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, for the record, one application for one temporary foreign worker has been approved for this project. My colleague knows that the TFW program are allowed only when Canadians or permanent residents are unable or unavailable to do a job. Our government is focused on creating partnerships and driving investments to create good, sustainable jobs for Canadians. Thanks to our government's support for this project, 2,500 full-time positions will be created at the Windsor Battery Plant, and an additional 2,500 local tradespeople will be engaged. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond-Arthabasca. Mr. Speaker, 8 years after the rollout of the Phoenix Pay system, the situation is not improving. In fact, it's getting worse. As of today, 242,000 transactions are still pending, which is twice as many as 2 years ago. Now, I understand that at the beginning of Phoenix, in a partisan squabble, the Liberal government wanted to try to pin the blame on the former Conservative government. But they've been in power for 8 years now, so no excuses are valid anymore for explaining why this fiasco hasn't been solved. Is anyone at PSPC answering for this fiasco, which is costing taxpayers a fortune and causing major problems for thousands of federal employees? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank our colleague for this question. Now, we agree that it's totally unacceptable that public servants are not being paid on time or being paid the right pay, and that's why we are working on this to ensure that pay issues are gradually decreased. We are trying to decrease the backlog of accumulated cases. And currently, we are hiring 600 additional employees to deal with these issues.
To point of order in just a minute, and I will recognize a member from Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes. I first wish to draw to the attention of members in the presence of the gallery of the Honourable Mitzi Dean, Minister of Children and Family Development for the province of British Columbia. It is also my pleasure to draw to the attention of members to the presence in the gallery of the recipients of the 2023 Governor General's History Awards.